From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana.
I'm a big believer in tariffs. I think tariffs are the most beautiful word. I think they're beautiful. It's going to make us rich.
It's not as if we weren't warned. Before he'd even returned to office, Trump was all about the T word.
We're subsidizing Canada to the tune of over $100 billion a year. We're subsidizing Mexico for almost $300 billion. We shouldn't be subsidizing. Why are we subsidizing these countries?
Yet, when his rhetoric was translated into policy, all hell seemed to break loose.
There are growing fears of a major global trade war tonight after President Trump announced sweeping tariffs on imports from Canada, Mexico and China starting tomorrow.
Having begun with a blitz attack, launching trade wars on multiple fronts, a few friendly phone calls were enough to bring Trump back from the brink, at least as far as Mexico and Canada are concerned, with both countries being given a month-long reprieve. But there are already fears of where he'll turn his focus next.
It will definitely happen with the European Union because they've really taken advantage of us. European Union is really out of line. UK is out of line, but I'm sure that one, I think that one can be worked out. But the European Union it's an atrocity.
And one country that's already been plunged into a trade war is China. All Chinese imports have now been hit with a 10% tax. And the Chinese have retaliated.
China now hitting back at President Donald Trump and the U.S. with tariffs on U.S. imports, as well as announcing an antitrust investigation into Google and putting several companies on notice for possible sanctions.
So as the world's two biggest economies square up over trade, what happens when Goliath meets, well, Goliath? How will it affect the rest of us? And is globalization now effectively in reverse? The story today: trade wars, Trump versus China.
So trade was very much top of his agenda, and you certainly saw that when he came into power again a couple of weeks ago. He certainly made quite a few pronouncements on the campaign trail around tariffs. So that's a tax on goods which are sold to the United States, so the exports of countries like China, but also, of course, Canada and Mexico.
That's Dr. Linda Yueh, an economist at Oxford University and London Business School, an all-round trade expert. Since Donald Trump came to power, he's been on the phone to world leaders with trade at the top of the agenda. 2 weeks ago, it was the turn of the Chinese president, Xi Jinping, and they had, supposedly, a very cordial conversation.
President Trump obviously has had a colorful career. He was a TV personality, real estate developer. He's written a number of books. One of them is called The Art of the Deal. So the way that he deals with people, I think with world leaders, the sense is he treats them as he would business partners. So President Xi Jinping of China would fall into that category. He would treat him pragmatically. And that is worth mentioning because it is different than how, I would say, American politicians might view China. He seems to deal with world leaders in I would say, more like a business transaction. He's a transactional politician. So he can separate commercial interests, it seems, from the other value judgments that other politicians can't. So I'm not surprised if he has cordial conversations because in business, that's how you do a negotiation.
And they went from a very warm conversation about 2 weeks ago to quite a lot happening in terms of Chinese-American relations, particularly the arrival of DeepSeek. How much do you think that will have worried people in Washington?
I think the DeepSeek story, as far as we know, is fascinating because it suggests as a reminder, DeepSeek, it's like ChatGPT, so it's generative AI, but unlike all of the ChatGPT models that have come out, as well as some of its competitors produced by different US tech companies, DeepSeek, the Chinese company, was done on the cheap, using its thought inferior chips because the US has had this ban on cutting edge chips to China for some time. It certainly has upended this sense of competition between the US and China in the area of tech because it changed the way we think about how you, for lack of a better word, win in the tech wars. And so you certainly see big questions around whether this is a Sputnik moment where the Americans need to get their skates on. So Sputnik refers to when Russia surprised the Americans by launching the first satellite in space. So this is going back to the moon landing, the Kennedy era of the 1960s, and it spurred American innovation. I don't know if that's quite the right analogy, but it just gives you a sense. It's a good example, in fact, of the deep-seated rivalry between the US and China.
Well, that's a really interesting point because you have this very old rivalry ramping up. The sense of competition is ramping up. And tariffs aren't a new part of this equation either. President Trump introduced them before, and President Biden kept them in place. Tell us about that.
President Trump and his first administration imposed tariffs. The Biden administration continued them, as well as continued the other restrictions like chips, the entity list, which prohibits American companies from investing in certain Chinese companies. And the latest round of tariffs announced by President Trump now is in addition to the existing tariffs on China.
So let's take a look at that decision to introduce these new tariffs. Why has Donald Trump chosen to do that now?
So tariffs have been used to counter unfair competition. So if you think that China is selling things cheaply to gain an advantage, if you put a tax on it, it raises the cost, makes it fair to compete against Chinese goods. You hear that in Europe as well. But I think what's different this time from previous times under Trump 2.0 is two things. So one is the reason why President Trump is levying these tariffs on China is because of the exports of fentanyl, which is an opiate drug. His reason for putting tariffs on Mexico and Canada, both of whom, by the way, are in a free trade agreement with the United States, that was negotiated under his first administration, is because of fentanyl imports and also immigration. So these are not the economic reasons that I mentioned a moment ago. This is the recent pattern of using trade to essentially negotiate and to settle disputes. The other thing worth saying is President Trump said he would impose across-the-board tariffs, so in other words, on every country. And his Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, said they might start with 2.5% tariffs on every country and then escalate it every month, unless the other countries come to the table and negotiate and make trade fair or stop doing the things that they don't want them to do, like immigration. I can't think of a time when we've had tariffs on every country that escalated. So This is new.
Linda, we'll come to some of the political reasons for these tariffs, because as you say, they don't seem to be economically driven. They are driven by politics, it's a trade war for political ends. Before we do, though, just talk us through some of the mechanics of this. How do the tariffs actually work? I mean, who ends up paying for them?
So a tariff is a tax on something which is imported. So think of a book that gets bought. If you put a tariff on it, then that's putting a tax on it. So if you put a tax at 25%, that book is now 25% more expensive. It's less competitive. So the impact on consumers is they could have bought that book for $10. And now it's going to cost them $12.50. So it is inflationary to put a tax on imports. For businesses, it is more worrying because the impact may not be direct. So in other words, if there are tariffs on specific goods, which is what we are currently looking at, then it starts to distort firms' production decisions. So take energy. They're going to start to think, I'm not sure what's going to happen in this area. Maybe I should avoid China altogether. And so what you find is a shifting of supply chains, which has not happened to a large extent, but I think the current dispute is going to make firms even more worried. So some supply chains have shifted. So for instance, exports from China to the US have fallen over the last few years, but exports through connector countries like Mexico and Vietnam have increased. So it's a shifting of global supply chains. And the other thing about connector countries is President Trump specifically doesn't like countries which run trade surpluses with the United States. It may be that he targets the connector countries, and which means you now have even more issues. You thought you, as a firm, changed your supply chain, and now you found that the new country has a trade surplus, and President Trump is going to target that country. In fact, he specifically said, I don't want Chinese cars coming through Mexico. So that is a big challenge to global supply chains.
So he doesn't like countries with a trade surplus with America. So these are countries that they're exporting more goods into America than they are buying American goods. With this tariff war, the trade wars that he seems to be talking about, we've seen him back down over Mexico and Canada. They're on hold. We don't quite know where they're going to land. He hasn't backed down on China, and the Chinese have responded. Tell us about that.
Canada and Mexico is interesting because their immediate response, everybody's well prepared for this because President Trump talked a lot about it when he was campaigning. They immediately announced their own retaliatory tariffs. So they were going to put tariffs when America sells. Now you have all the chips on the table, and then they went to the table and they declared a truce. So, for instance, Canada is going to move troops to the American-Canadian border to stop fentanyl movement and immigration. So that's how they ended up in a 30-day truce. So then he announced the tariffs on China, and then China announced a bunch of tariffs on U.S. energy, on restricting exports of rare earths. So these are minerals that go into producing things like the iPhone and green technologies. And China has a near monopoly on a number of those. So that's quite an important component for a lot of American manufacturing, because remember, this is about manufacturing. And then China's also announced its own entity list. And they've launched an antitrust investigation against Google. They're looking at NVIDIA, the chip maker, Intel, and they've filed a complaint at the World Trade Organization. So I view all of these things as chips now are on the table. They'll negotiate with President Trump, who did write a book called The Art of the Deal.
And as you say, the chips are on the table. Just give us a sense of the fear on both sides. I mean, if they don't manage to come up with some kind of a truce, just how bad would it be? How damaging could those tariffs be for China and for America?
Well, just take the International Monetary Fund's assessment. If the U.S. went for across-the-board tariffs, they reckon it'll reduce global growth by 0.8%. Global growth is just over 3%. That's a huge chunk.
Yeah.
Where would a lot of that fall? Probably on China and the U.S. as the world's biggest traders. So China's economy is struggling after property bust. Growth has slowed. The U.S. is in a better position economically, but the U.S. has a trade war on multiple fronts. So this, I think, is the big unknown. I think someone asked President Trump about the economic damage that could happen to America as a result of the trade wars.
We may have short-term a little pain, and people understand that, but long-term, the United States has been ripped off by virtually every country in the world. We have deficits with almost every country, not every country, but almost, and we're going to change it.
He said something like, you have to take the short-term pain, but we'll win in the end. So there will be either a direct impact or an impact on inflation as a result of the trade wars, which is not great for the U.S. That being said, we talked about how trade wars have been going on for decades. It is still pretty commonly used as a tool, and I expect this will continue for some time.
Linda, You explained how the reasons behind many of these threats of tariffs are political rather than economic. And one of the big drivers for President Trump seems to be fentanyl. Tell us about that.
So it's an opioid. And the US has had a massive opiate crisis. Some economists have dubbed it the economics of despair. So there has been such a hollowing out of the middle section of what we would consider to be well-paid blue-collar jobs. And they have linked that to the opiate crisis. Working-age men are dropping out of work, and they're becoming addicted to opioids. There have been an increase in suicides. So there is a long-standing issue here.
I've told China, you want to sell we're going to have a good relationship with China, hopefully. I want to have a good relationship. But you sell fentanyl into the United States through Mexico. We're putting a 25% or so tariff on until such time as you stop doing it. And they're not going to do it for long because that is a massive penalty.
China's retort to this is, it's an American problem. Is this the way to resolve the opiate crisis? That's a more complicated topic, but I would say for China, it's unlikely to be the main reason. Despite it being said it was the reason, it's unlikely to be the main reason why the US is in a trade war with China, because it has been in a trade war with China for years. I think this is just the latest version of it.
It's interesting, though, that a lot of Americans, a lot of Republicans in particular, do talk about China and fentanyl.
It has led to the death of 70,000 Americans because of fentanyl. China is sending these chemicals.
And this being almost, stepping back historically, almost like the Opium War Part 2. Tell us a bit about that, why they're charging it with that sort of historical importance.
So the Opium War in China, that was the 8 powers, so the 8 colonial powers, including, of course, Britain, had carved out pieces of China, and they were exporting opium. And this was a hugely contentious chapter, obviously, among many contentious chapters in the history of imperialism. So that's quite an emotive subject, I would say, as you would imagine, for that period of history.
Yeah.
I think that of all the things which China has done, are they vigilant about the trading of fentanyl? They probably could be more vigilant. Is this really about another opium war in the US-China relationship? We discussed the CHIPS restrictions, we discussed winning on AI, we discussed rare earths that go into consumer products, we discussed the entity list, there's a lot there. And I would say, if you think back just a few years ago, the main topic of dispute with China was over the treatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang province and modern slavery. So there's a lot going on here between US and China, and I think this is just the latest chapter, but it's not the ending of the book. There's a lot more to come, because ultimately, I've always said, we live now what international relations scholars have called the era of great power competition. And this era is between US and China. This tension is about power, but I don't think it's about any one particular thing. In many ways, I don't even think trade is a part of it. I think it's fundamentally more about who wins the 21st century. And I don't really know what it means to win the 21st century, except that, both countries would like to do better. And that's a good thing. But economists would say to do better, you should have a level playing field and global trading rules. That's how every country does better. That's the theory of comparative advantage in international trade.
It's so true. I mean, it does feel like a lot of this, as you say, is about this great power competition. The world is, all the blocks that we've known are changing. It feels like sort of the world order is up for grabs suddenly. Is there a sense that this is what we're seeing now is the reversal of this great trend of globalization that we've watched over the last century, which, as you say, most economists would tell you leads to better growth for most people and a better deal for most consumers around the world? Is that all now on its way out?
I think globalization goes through periods where it is challenged, and there are reasons why globalization hasn't worked for a lot of people. Globalization always creates losers. So if you specialize in an area, we talked about the hollowing out of the US highly paid blue-collar workers. That's a combination of China producing those things and technology producing those things. And so tariffs are used as a form of protectionism to protect the sector, the industry, or the region. But that often doesn't get at the root of the problem, which is when people get displaced, they need help. They need financial help, they need training, they need upskilling, they need support. So we are in an era where I think that backlash against globalization is certainly there. So I would say that this period of what's been described as hyperglobalization in the 1990s, that period created a lot of losers, as well as a lot of winners. And that period is now being challenged. So I think we're now in a period where the consensus around globalization has broken down. And I think people would like to see a different way of trading with countries, fairer, greener, more equally, which is why I mentioned the 1990s, because by 2001, the World Trade Organization had launched a development round called the Doha Round to try and make trade fairer. And that round failed a few years ago, so that's no longer in train.
And as you said, if it feels like a lot of this, is political rather than economic, but also even the politics are often sometimes thin, will it work?
So I suspect they'll come to probably not a complete truce, because this rivalry is much more deep-seated. But I think they will come out with some type of compromise or agreement, so it's not economically damaging as it looks right now, because that's the thing with tariffs. We talked about consumers pay more, firms, they're going to end up having to change the way they produce things. It's not great for companies. It's just not great for economic growth. And both the US and China would probably want to limit economic damage. And that's the thing about Trump. He's a pragmatic guy.
Yeah. But these potential trade wars come at a time where America, losing its dominance, which is an uncomfortable position for many Americans. Do you think that's driving some of these tariff wars? Is it about trying to seize control again?
America has a number of economic challenges, but America remains the most innovative country. We economists use America as the benchmark for innovation, for improvements in productivity. And you can see the mega companies that come out of the US, which dominate the new digital economy. So America is very entrepreneurial, it's very innovative, but it hasn't been the sole decision maker, at least in terms of driving global growth for years. So I suppose the question is, the US continues to be, right now, it's the fastest growing major economy. It's faster growing than the UK and other European countries. So it's not absolutely clear that the social challenges of America are really translating into the kind of economic decline we have seen through history. For instance, when the UK ceded its position as the superpower, with the decline of empire, and then eventually the loss of sterling as the reserve currency. That's why I wonder if this is really about economics, or is it really just about power, maintaining itself as the gold standard, the place that sets the rules, which means economists have very little to say about that.
That was Dr. Linda Yueh, economist at the University of Oxford and London Business School. You can find all of the latest coverage on Donald Trump and the tariffs at thetimes.com with a subscription. The producers today were Olivia Case and Sam Chantarasak. The executive producer was Kate Ford, and sound design and theme composition were by Mal Assetto. If you enjoyed this podcast, please do leave us a review. It'll help others to find it. Thanks for listening. See you tomorrow.